Now, Cameron McAllister is here, and he's going to be bringing a topic, Is God Optional? And you may know Cameron from somewhere else when he comes up on the stage. You might recognize him. That's Cameron there. But he was in a movie. I don't know if you guys knew this, but have you ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Have you ever seen that movie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off? And do we have the picture of Cameron? I couldn't believe it myself. It's not the real guy, but... Give it up for Cameron McAllister, everyone. Cameron Fry.
May I requisition this? Okay. Well, good to see everybody. And thank you, everyone, for being here on a Saturday of all days. Many of you have come from far and wide. And as you can see, I've come all the way from Chicago, from the set of Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, to be with you. My entire life, I grew up in Europe, and ever since I started interacting with people who watch a lot of American movies, they have always said to me, "Oh my gosh, dude, do you know who you look like? Have you ever seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off? You look exactly like Cameron Fry." And so now, instead of running away from it, I've just embraced my inner Cameron Fry. So I'm comfortable with that now. Well, we had lunch not too long ago, and Wayside came up here and brought a lot of energy. Are we past the food coma stage? Are we past the post-lunch slump? I wrote an article for this event, and it was on zombies. I hope I'm not dealing with a room of zombies here. I'm going to open with a joke and try to wake you up a little bit. This joke, if you don't think it's funny, I didn't come up with it, so I'll blame it on the comedian. But this joke has to do with the importance of questions. The comedian who wrote this joke is from New York, so pardon the poor imitation. Here goes. I had once a pain in the chestal area, and I was sure that it was heartburn. But I was concerned because it was in the chestal area, but I didn't want to go to the doctor and pay $25 to have it confirmed that all I had was heartburn. But then it hits me. I have a friend, Eggs Benedict, who has a pain in his chestal area in that exact same spot. And I figure if I can get old Eggs to go to the doctor, well, then I can beat the medic out of 25 big ones. So I call up Eggs, and I con Eggs. I lay it on him, and he goes. Turns out he's got heartburn. Cost him $25. Now I feel great. Because, I figure I just saved $25. Call Eggs up 2 days later. He died. I rush to the hospital immediately. I have a whole battery of tests run, x-rays. Cost me $150. It turns out I have heartburn. I'm furious. I run to Eggs' mother and I say, "Did he suffer much?" She said, "No, it was quick. Car hit him, and that was it." It's incredibly important to ask the right questions. Oftentimes we find ourselves asking the wrong questions. Asking good questions is actually a bit of an art. Today, the question I'm going to be confronting and that we're going to explore together is God optional? Do we really need God? As we labor through life, is it necessary to have a God by our side? Or is God just a convenient little crutch, a psychological prop who helps us get through the day, not too unlike a glorified teddy bear? Do I need God? I think that the question of whether God is optional or not is also intensely practical, because it drills in to the practical affairs of our day-to-day lives. And the more I travel around the world talking about God and the gospel of Jesus Christ, the more I see that many people have formed the sad conclusion that Christianity has nothing to do with life. Maybe it's a set of beliefs or assumptions, maybe it's the Ten Commandments, maybe it's sort of Bible verses that one memorizes and spits out in a Sunday school class or in a church service, but by and large, many people, I think, don't think Christianity has any bearing on their lives. before we launch into this, you have some skeletal notes in front of you. They're very threadbare because guess what? I have this sneaking suspicion that if I give you tons and tons of notes, you'll be distracted by them and you won't listen to me. Now, you also have cell phones and various other means of distraction, but I'm going to put my trust in you. Stop Googling pictures of Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. But here's the way we're going to go. This question, is God optional, for my notes has spawned 3 other questions which have a direct bearing on this. We're going to be asking, what do we mean by God? What do we mean by person? And what do we mean by life? Here's why we're asking those 3 questions. What do we mean by God? There is widespread confusion, believe it or not, on the most elementary item in this question. Many people do not have a sound working definition of God. In fact, there's a theologian who I really like. He's a grumpy theologian, but I like grumpy theologians, and I can be a little bit of a grump myself. But he has a book in which he says that most of the questions, most of the debates, most of the arguments, the back and forth concerning God's existence go nowhere because neither side has a proper understanding of what we mean when we say God. So we've got to get that one right before we proceed. So what do we mean by God? And then why am I talking about what we mean when we talk about persons and life? Here's why. Is God optional? We have to ask, is he optional for whom? Who is he optional for? And what is he optional for? For whom and for what? For whom, when we ask who God is optional for, who he's optional for, I assume we don't have in mind lions, tigers, and bears. We could, but we're asking, is God optional for you, for me, for human beings, for persons? What is a person? And finally, what is God optional for? What is life? Because Christianity has everything to do with life. So when we talk about what God is, what do we mean when we say God? Oftentimes, one of the confusions that sort of masquerades here is that we think of God as simply a very powerful, great thing among lesser things, or a great being among lesser beings. Kind of like a Greek god, which would be called a demiurge, or kind of like a superhero. But here's the problem with that. When Christians speak about God, when we speak of God, we are not talking about one really great being among lesser beings. One really great thing among lesser things like stars and cabbages and lions, tigers, and bears. We are talking about the very source of existence in the first place. We are talking about the unconditioned source of all that exists. When I say the unconditioned source, that might sound a little bit abstract. I just said that Christianity has everything to do with life. You may be backing up a little bit here and saying, this sounds pretty abstract. This doesn't have a lot to do with life, supposedly. What I mean by that is God is the first mover. He's the one with no beginning and no end. When we look around here, this building wasn't always here. Somebody had to come and lay the brick and mortar very intentionally and follow a plan to get this building up in the first place. And those people who executed the plan, who built the building, were not always here either. And you haven't always been here either. The world can turn just as swiftly without your existence. Everything that we see around us in the created order owes its existence to something else. It depends for its existence on something else. But if we just keep tracing that back and back and back, we have to conclude that either we're going to have an infinite regress, either it just goes back forever and ever and ever, which seems unlikely, or there is a primal, fundamental source of all that exists. This, I am suggesting to you today, is what we mean by God. The primal source of all that exists. Perfect, self-sufficient, uncaused, without beginning or end, and necessary. He exists necessarily. This is why God is the only one who can answer with those majestic words from Exodus 3:14. I am that I am. It's a remarkable statement. And there's only one being that can give such an answer. But one of the dangers as we're in this territory, and I promise this talk will get progressively less abstract, but we've got to get off on the right footing here. But one of the dangers here is that oftentimes when we proceed along this line of reasoning, people will confuse the creation and the Creator. You see, the world around us is and was created by God, is sustained by God, but it is not God. Let me see if I can make this a little bit more clear. J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter, did she not? She is the listed author on the book. She wrote Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a personal display and manifestation of her creative power. But she is not Harry Potter. And Harry Potter is not her. Even though her signature, the imprint of her mind, is all over those pages, she remains transcendent and distinct. Creation is a manifestation and a display of God's personal creative power. But He is not that creation. The creation is distinct from Him. His imprint, His signature is all over it. But He remains transcendent in the same way that the author of a book remains transcendent from the book that he or she wrote. This is the nature of what we're talking about. We're getting to the root of one of the most fundamental questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? You see, all great thought, all great inquiry, all great reasoning begins with one simple thing: wonder. Wonder that anything exists in the first place. This might sound a little strange, but if you look at something, have you ever played the game where you say a word over and over and over again? Repeat the word: elephant, 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 rose, rose, rose. And as you repeat it, it becomes disassociated from all the familiarity. It gets ripped out of the scenery of the commonplace. And suddenly you see it for what it is: a strange, odd collection of sounds that's totally unnecessary. It doesn't have to be the way it is. A rose doesn't have to look the way it does. An elephant doesn't have to look the way it does. And a human face doesn't have to look the way it does. Have you ever stared for a long time into somebody else's face? It's probably best to do this with a photograph or footage. Don't do it to me right now too hard, because looking at somebody in the moment is actually kind of dangerous and uncomfortable. But there is something remarkable, something strange about a human face. Maybe you do this in the mirror. I don't know. I never do. But as we're disassociated, as we take a few steps back, we realize that none of this is, strictly speaking, necessary. You didn't have to exist. I didn't have to exist. A rose doesn't have to look the way it does. You see, if creation is true, if God brought all this into being, it is a gift. Existence, creation, is a gift, not unlike what an artist brings into the world when he or she gives us a sculpture or a painting or a poem, a gift. A philosopher I like named Peter Kraft has a funny story he tells. He says, you want proof of original sin? Just ask yourself, what was the first thought in your mind when your alarm clock went off this morning? Was it, all the stuff I've got to do? I have to give a talk this afternoon to people who are going to think I'm awkward and weird and look like Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I have to go to a conference, drive all day. Or was it, Lord, you're here. Thank you. Lord, I exist. I can live and move and breathe. Thank you. Existence. We look at our world around us, and it is filled with what I can only call thank yous. Left, right, and center, people trying to give praise, people trying to worship whatever it is that has brought this all into being. A number of years ago, there was an interesting movie that came out called American Beauty. This is not necessarily a recommendation for this film, but there's a scene in the film that's become quite iconic. There's an odd character in the movie. His name is Ricky Fitz. Ricky Fitz likes to stroll around everywhere with a handheld camera, video camera, recording footage of what appear to be some fairly odd scenes. And one day, he decides that he wants to show his girlfriend Jane the quote-unquote most beautiful thing he's ever seen. So, they head up to his room. He inserts a VHS cassette tape into the VCR. This should tell you how old the movie is. And they sit there for 15 minutes watching footage of a plastic bag blowing around in the wind. Wow, that's deep. Aren't you moved? I don't see any tissues coming out. What's wrong with you people? Do you have hearts of stone? Well, what's going on? Well, he says, we get a clue when he talks. He says, it was one of those days where it was a minute away from snowing, and there was this electricity in the air. You could almost see it. And this bag was just dancing with me for 15 minutes. That was the day I realized that there's this whole hidden life behind things. And this incredibly benevolent force that wanted me to know that no matter what happens, I didn't need to be afraid. Everything was going to be all right. The video is a poor excuse, I know, but it helps me remember. I have to remember. He says this with tears in his eyes. Now, what is going on here? See, this is a moment of worship. This is a thank you moment for the sheer extravagance of isness, of existence in the first place. It would have been helpful for Ricky Fitz if he had gone to Acts chapter 17, where the Apostle Paul comes across an altar dedicated to an unknown God. And he says, I noticed this altar dedicated to an unknown God. What you worship in ignorance, what you're content to not know, I wish to proclaim to you. His name is Jesus Christ. He is the uncaused cause of all that exists. He is the creator of everything you see. And your thank you should go to him. People desperate to thank someone, something, for the sheer extravagance of existence in the first place. Where did it all come from? God is the unconditioned source of all that exists. That's the first question, and that's the first point. Is God optional for whom? Here's the second question. Well, we're talking about persons. So what do we mean when we talk about a person? Here's what we mean. A person is a spiritual creature. You are a spiritual creature, and this striking fact accounts for so much of the tension that you feel in your life. On the one hand, you have basic animal needs. You have to eat, you have to drink, and you have to rest, and you're dependent on others, especially when you're first born, to survive, to live, to get through a day. But you're also so much more than just a survivor. Because on the one hand, while we have to eat, drink, and sleep, we also paint paintings, make movies, write poems, and build bridges, and dream dreams, and hold conferences about big deal questions. And we have seminars on what we need to do for our career, and how we find our calling in life, and how we find our purpose in life. This is very strange behavior for an animal. I just got an animal in my life. It's my dog, and her name is Magnolia. Write that down if you're taking notes. It's important. Just kidding. But you know what I've noticed about Magnolia? She is really good at being a dog. It comes remarkably naturally to her. Dogginess is not something she struggles with. She does not struggle with her calling in life. She does not struggle with being a dog. And yet I can tell you honestly, as funny and glib as that might sound, I have often struggled with what it means to be a person. Have you? Many of you are very young. But many of you are already getting hints and have already confronted the question that flickers into life as soon as self-consciousness really takes charge. You see, most of us will spend the great majority of our lives dedicated to one very simple, deceptively simple mystery. And we want to answer this one simple question. Who am I? Who am I? Who is this person that confronts me in the mirror every morning, toothbrush in hand? Who am I? I don't understand myself. I don't understand the things I do. We struggle with our personhood because there is so much more to us than just staying alive. There was a book that came out last year by a Canadian author, and set largely, a good portion of the book is set in Toronto. It's called Station 11. Station 11 is a post-apocalyptic book. Post-apocalyptic books are really popular right now. It's kind of unsettling. But this is a very tender post-apocalyptic book. I've never read one quite like it. In the book, most of the population is wiped out by a devastating flu epidemic. And electricity is gone. In fact, all modern conveniences are comprehensively dismantled, gone, a thing of the past. Cell phones, computers, all these kinds of things actually show up in a museum after the world has been wiped out. But what the book is about is a group of Shakespearean actors and a professional symphony who join forces and travel around from settlement to settlement, reminding the survivors of this devastating flu epidemic that life is about more than just staying alive. And they perform Shakespearean plays. And the motto of this traveling symphony, they're called the Traveling Symphony, is interesting. It's because survival is insufficient. Their motto is because survival is insufficient. Now, if the hyper nerds among you may recognize that phrase, it comes in fact from episode 122 of Star Trek Voyager. If you didn't know that, you should be happy. If you did know that, I'm sorry. But it's because life is about more than just staying alive, because we have spiritual hungers as well. When you beat a person down, when you take them down to their bare essentials, there still exists this flickering hope for more than just survival. In fact, when people are reduced to mere survival, that is one of the most devastating tragedies we can see. A concentration camp gave people basic food and basic shelter. But only a lunatic or a sadist would insist that a concentration camp is an ideal living situation. Because there is more to us than just staying alive. We are spiritual creatures because we were created by a God who is spirit. And so we have spiritual hungers that drive us along. Because survival is insufficient is an interesting phrase because it's actually a rewording of Deuteronomy 8:3, which says, "Man shall not live on bread alone." But the most famous exponent of this phrase was Jesus. He says it as he's being tempted in the wilderness. 40 days he's been fasting. He's hungry, he's tired, he's weary. And the devil, who's always got great timing in these moments, comes to him and says, "Turn these stones into bread. You're hungry? Physician, heal thyself. Do that." And he says, "Man shall not live on bread alone." Later on, he's going to expound on this. In John chapter 4, his disciples come to him and they say, "Rabbi, eat." And he says, "I have food you do not know about." And they're confused. They're taking him very literally here. They say, "What, did he sneak some bread in the toga there or something? I didn't bring him any food. Did you bring him food? Did you bring him food?" And then he helps them out a little bit. And he says, "My food is to do the will of the one who sent me. My food is to do the Father's will." Your food is meaning and purpose, to do the will of the Lord who made you, who fashioned you in the first place. Man shall not live on bread alone. You are a spiritual creature. So the third question is optional for what? We're asking, is God optional for life? Very few of us, unless we've experienced deep tragedy or unless something is very wrong, want actively to die. And actually, people who do want to die because life doesn't feel like life anymore, ironically. We don't want to die. We want life, but we want a manner and a quality of life that is very unusual. You see, we don't just want endless life. We don't want a monotonous succession of days. We want what Christ calls abundant life. We want new life. Life that doesn't get old. Life that doesn't wear down. And in fact, some of the monsters that are very popular right now, think about a zombie. What is a zombie? I actually don't find zombies that interesting, but I've had a lot of people ask me about zombies because I look into culture a lot. What I do find interesting is that we find them so interesting. Why they're so popular, why we continue to make shows like The Walking Dead, why we make movies. Why are zombies so interesting? Here's one reason I think zombies are so interesting. Because a zombie is nothing but a slave to its own appetites. A zombie is literally imprisoned in its own body. Now, zombies, fortunately, do not exist, but most of us in this room can imagine what living death looks like. And when we look at our jaded culture filled with overstimulation, entertainment galore, we see addiction spread wide. What is an addict? I think in many ways a zombie looks like the embodiment of some of our deepest nightmares about addiction. When we are a slave to our appetites, we do things that we don't want to do. In fact, we desperately want to stop. In fact, we often recognize that this thing is killing me and it's killing those around me who love me, and yet I feel powerless, controlled by my appetites. That is a kind of life suffered by many people. Or think about vampires. Gosh, this is just turning into horror hour, isn't it? Vampires are very popular too. And yet, generally speaking, do we portray vampires, besides Twilight, where they're sparkly and twinkly and cute, do we portray vampires as happy-go-lucky? Yay, I get to live forever! This is great! Generally speaking, vampires are portrayed as cynical, wizened, bored with life, angry, confined and imprisoned in a life that is an endless succession of days. No kind of life. No, what we want is eternal life. What we want is perpetual newness. We want things to not get old. We don't want to be worn down. We don't want to be controlled by our appetites, though so often we are. We want what Christ calls abundant life. I'm going to confess something to you. The idea of heaven, I grew up in a Christian household. I had my moments of deep struggle when I went to high school, but I was fortunate enough to grow up in a Christian household surrounded by wonderful men and women of the Lord. But I will make a confession to you. The idea of heaven always scared me. Anybody else freaked out by heaven occasionally? Anybody else think, oh no, heaven, great, we get to go to heaven where we sing holy, 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 day and night, all day, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and it never changes. Yay! That sounds great. Aren't you excited? Yes! No. I'll confess I often thought that. Why? Because I wasn't associating Christianity with life. And yet Christ says, his very stated aim, his mission was, he said, I came that they might have life, and that abundantly. I came that they might have abundant life. John 10:10. You see, when Christ returns, and he is coming back, The promise is not that he's going to whisk us away to some foggy spiritual realm where nothing is real, everything's intangible, and we're just floating around like freewheeling spirits. Oh no. He's coming back to make all things new. He's bringing forth a new heavens and a new earth. This is real, concrete, tangible stuff. This is a real world with a real life in which you will be interacting. You will be living. And in fact, right now, if you are following Christ, you are being prepared, even as we speak, for that new world. Abundant life is the promise. That's what you're made for. C.S. Lewis says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most likely explanation is that I was made for another world. Ladies and gentlemen, you are spiritual creatures, and I am here to tell you that you are in fact made for another world. And nothing here, if you rest all of your hopes and all of your dreams, if you confine them only to this world, you'll be frustrated, you'll be disappointed, and ultimately, you'll be heartbroken. Because this world is crumbling. This world is not everlasting. It is passing away, but you were made for another kind of life. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says that God has set eternity in the hearts of men. That's a staggering claim. God has set eternity in the hearts of men. You're a spiritual creature with eternity in your heart. And your desires, your longings for nothing less than abundant life will be fulfilled by no one less than an everlasting God. Which brings us to our final point, and this is not in your notes. I'm sorry, but you can maybe scribble it in the margins. Is God optional? Optional for whom and optional for what? Well, if what I've said so far is true, all of existence owes its very being to God and is sustained and continually upheld by God. And you were created and fashioned by God. And one of the central clues to that is your heart that is satisfied by nothing less than eternity. We often go looking for it in all the wrong places. But that's what drives us relentlessly, frenetically. We long to be loved unconditionally. And the wonderful, resounding truth of Christianity is that you were made for a relationship with the unconditioned source of all that exists, with the God who fashioned you and brought everything into being. But this God is not just remote. He's not just described by philosophical phrases like unconditioned source of all that exists, but he actually comes to us to meet us. My friend and colleague Nathan Betts can't say it better than he did. In order for us to go to God, God comes to us. This is Jesus Christ. This is the incarnation where Christ takes on flesh. You might say that this is a little bit like the author becoming a character in his own drama. He walks in our shoes. He takes on flesh. This is a great mystery. But let me expound on mystery for 1 second. I don't mean mystery in the sense that this is something you can never understand. Sometimes we hear the word mystery and that's what we think. I'm talking more about something that we can't wrap our minds around. We know that our universe is vast. We know that comparatively speaking, this planet Earth is a cosmic mote of dust. We can look and read books on physics. We can look into these facts, and we can even say these facts out loud. We can recite these astronomical distances, but we can't wrap our minds around these massive truths. In the same way, we can talk about the incarnation. We can talk about and say, as theologians do, that Christ is very God, very man. Fully God and fully man. infinite and perfect, and yet fully human. And we cannot wrap our minds around that. But he has revealed himself to us, and he meets us. Is God necessary for life? Can you go through life without acknowledging God? Yes, of course, you can, and many people do. But the options are stark. Take God out of the equation, and life loses its ultimate meaning and purpose. Let me qualify this real quickly. I am not saying that if you're not a Christian, or I am not saying that if you're an atheist, you can't lead a good, exemplary life. That you can't be a kind person, a giving person, a sacrificing person. I know people like this. But what I am saying is that ultimately your behavior is going to be a bit of an enigma, because there is no ultimate purpose to anything that exists. If everything that exists comes ultimately from nothing, if you trace your lineage back to a cosmic accident, you lose meaning, you lose purpose, and you are reduced to nothing more than a survivor. And as Michelle Tepper was saying, it becomes survival of the fittest. And the expression, man shall not live on bread alone, changes. In fact, a very famous atheist named, now since I grew up in a Germanic country, I can actually pronounce his name, but don't worry about it. His name is Ludwig Feuerbach. Ludwig Feuerbach. Everything's in German, isn't it? Ludwig Feuerbach said, "Du bist, was du frisst. Du bist, was du isst." Translation, you are what you eat. Is that true? Without God, it is. Without God, you're nothing more than the sum of your material parts. Without God, you're not an eternal creature. You're just a creature. You'll live your brief life, you'll toil around on this planet, and then you'll die, and it won't make any ultimate difference. And the fact that the universe existed, and in fact we know, we have it on good authority, that the universe is winding down. And eventually, all matter will wind down. All stars will cool. Everything will come to a ceasefire. And you know what? If there is no God, it made no difference that all of this existed. This is why another philosopher with a very colorful last name, Jean-Paul Sartre, said that human beings are useless passions. He said, you and I are useless passions because we have all these deep-seated desires for glory, for eternity, for everlasting life. And if there is no God, which he firmly believed, they mean nothing and they mock us. But I am suggesting to you today that God is fundamentally necessary for the very fact that existence, that isness surrounds us, for the very fact that you exist, and he wants to know you personally. He wants to be your God. He wants you to be his disciple. Disciple sounds like kind of a fancy word nowadays, sadly. You know what that means? That means that you recognize that Christ is your Lord and your master, and you want to look to him to teach you how to live. Without God, you're alone. You're going it alone. You're laboring through this world which is full of trial and struggle, all on your own. This is why God says in Matthew 11, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light." That picture is a pretty startling one to me. My yoke. You know what the picture is he's conjuring here? He's conjuring two oxen, two donkeys, yoked together in a stock, laboring together and pulling a cart. That's an awfully humble picture for the unconditioned source of all reality to paint. Because donkeys, oxes, they have another word that we use for them sometimes, and I don't need to say it up here because I don't want to get kicked off the stage, but it rhymes with class. You know what it is. The picture he is giving is two beasts of burden laboring together through life. Through life's struggles, through all of the pain, toward a goal of eternal rest and eternal joy. The very God of all creation wants to walk side by side with you through life and to teach you how to live. Christianity is about life. And heaven is not something we need to be afraid of. Heaven will be a perpetual adventure. Heaven will be the most exciting thing you can't imagine. Paul says, in heaven, when it's restored, things which eye has not seen, ear has not heard, and which have not entered the heart of man, this is all that God has prepared for those who love him. I'm going to end with this story. In the third book in C.S. Lewis's, it's already gotten one mention up here, Beloved Chronicles of Narnia, Lucy, who's probably the most spiritually alert of the children in the Narnia series, has been longing for a reunion with Aslan, who is the Christ figure of these books. And it's been her heart's desire to see Aslan again. She has just longed for this moment, and finally, she comes face to face with Aslan again. And she says, Aslan, you're bigger. And he says, that is because you are older, child. And she says, and you are not? He says, no, child, I am not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger. This is the God we serve. The more you grow, the more you seek the face of Christ, the more he will reveal of himself to you, and he will be bigger and bigger, and this is a foretaste of heaven from the God who is bigger. Thank you so much for your attention and your time. I know that you've gotten a lot of information today.